Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Peah. We're up to Perek Aleph, Mishnah Hey, the final Mishnah in this Perek. The Mishnah now is going to discuss a very interesting topic. We learned previously that you have to leave a corner of the field when you harvest. You can harvest all the way to a certain amount, which we said rabbinically is 1/60 is worth of your produce, and from there you have to stop. You cannot harvest that. You leave that to the poor people. Now, what if a person harvested the entire field? He didn't leave anything standing. Does he still have to leave the produce amount of peah for the poor people? The halacha is, yes, he does. He did a prohibition. The Torah says, Lo tichaleh peah sadecha liktzor. You cannot harvest till the end of the field. He violated that. But the pasuk also says that ani v'lagel ta'azov, you must leave it for the convert or the poor. Even though you harvest till the end, which you weren't supposed to do, you still must leave for the poor or the convert. Therefore, he has to still leave it. However, the Mishnah is going to discuss when does this peah become exempt from giving tithes and when doesn't it? Meaning, if I give this peah to a poor person, does the poor person have to take off the 10%, the 12%, 2 to the Kohen and 10 to the Levi? Or can he have the full peah without having to separate it? At which stage? The Mishnah writes, Le'olam hu noten mishum peah patur min ha'ma'asrot. You always give produce as peah, even if you harvested the whole field. And it's exempt from ma'asrot, meaning the Levi, the poor person that's going to get it, does not have to give the different ma'asrot, or the owner, ad shimerach, until you smooth the pile of produce. If you smooth the pile of produce, which the Mefarshim explains, smoothing the produce means after you harvest the produce, it's processed to remove stalks, other inedible parts, gathered into a pile, which is then smoothed, and then mounted up into a heap, right? And then you smooth it. Once you smooth it, you set the obligation for having to give masrot, which means you can't eat anymore or benefit from it. If you were to give this peah now to a poor person, that poor person would lose out. He would have to separate 12%. Therefore, if you smooth the produce and then you realize I didn't give peah, you have to separate maaser and then give the peah, because we don't want the poor person to have to separate it. We want him to have a full amount that you give him. Therefore, until you smooth the pile, it's exempt from maaser. You give him the produce to the poor person and everyone's good. Once you smooth the pile, you must take off maaser, the 12%, 2 to the Kohen and 10 to the Levi, before you give the peah to the corner of the field to the poor person. The Mishnah continues now a bunch of other laws that are applicable to this concept of smoothing. You can give away produce as hefker without having to separate ma'asrot until you smooth it. However, once you smooth it, it becomes obligated now in ma'asrot, even if it is hefker afterwards. You can feed a full feeding of untithed produce to animals, beasts, birds, and it's exempt from ma'asrot until you smooth the pile. Right? Once the pile has been smooth, you cannot feed anymore an animal a full feeding from these produce until you tithe it. Rabbi Akiva has another chidush. She says you can take from untithed produce from the threshing floor, which is the ground where they cut the produce and separate the edible parts from the inedible parts right before it's piled and smooth and piled. Right? Rabbi Akiva says you could take untithed produce from the threshing floor, plant it, and it's exempt from tithes until you smooth the pile. Once you smooth the pile, if you want to plant it, use it as seeds in the ground, you must take off ma'asrot. That is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. However, Chachamim hold both before you smooth and after you smooth it. You always have to take off ma'asir if you want to take from this grain and replant it in the ground. Right? Rabbi Akiva says, Ad shimareach. The Rabbi Akiva, however, Chachamim hold in any case. The last halakha, the Mishnah discusses 2 other laws regarding this smoothing. Kohen veLevi shlakhu et hagoren. If you have a Kohen and Levi that bought the produce from the threshing floor, amasrot shalem, they can keep the tithes. Meaning they bought the produce, they don't have to give 2% to a Kohen and 10% to a Levi. They keep the 2% for themselves because he's a Kohen, or the 10% for themselves because he's a Levi. Ad shemarech, until you smooth it. However, if you bought the untithed produce after it was smooth, the Kohen has to give 2%. You have to give 2% to the Kohen. You have to give 10% to the Levi. Why did the Chachamim make this decree once it's smooth? Very simple. The rabbis were concerned what's going to be. You're going to have a wealthy Kohen, a wealthy Levi. They're going to come and buy all the untithed produce of a farmer, knowing that they get to keep for themselves the 2% and 10%, thereby leaving nothing for poor Kohanim and poor Levim. You have a poor Kohen that's going to come right now to collect his ma'asel. The owner is going to say, I sold it all to a Kohen, and that Kohen gets to keep it to himself. And it ends up being that poor Kohanim and Levim don't get any produce. Therefore, Chachamim say, once it's smoothed over, even if a Kohen buys it, he has to separate 2%. Even if a Levi buys it, he has to separate 10%. Why? Only when it's smooth? Because Chachamim say that it's not usual to buy a lot of untithed produce before it's smoothed over. It's a little abnormal. Therefore, we don't make decrees in abnormal cases. It's more normal to buy a large amount after it's smooth. And once it's smooth, we make you separate the Ma'aser to the Kohen and Levi respectively, even if you're a Kohen and Levi, because we don't want the poor people to lose out on their share of the Ma'aser. Last halacha in the Mishnah, Hamakdish Podeh Chayav b'Ma'aserot Ad Shemeach HaGizbar. One who consecrates his produce to the Bet HaMikdash and then redeems it has to give Ma'aser when he buys it back, unless the Gizbar, the temple official, either smoothed it himself or oversaw the smoothing process while it was under his jurisdiction. Let us explain. You could donate your produce to the Bet HaMikdash, you consecrate it, now it becomes holy. After the Gizbar, the one in charge of the funds, the temple official, he oversees the smoothing process. If you redeem it back, which you could do by giving the money over, the amount of the produce to the treasure, to the temple treasury, and you get the produce back, it's a for Ma'aser. However, if you consecrated it and bought it back right away before it was smoothed under the jurisdiction of the temple official, you have to give Ma'aser again. It never became exempt. You have to give your Ma'aser. And it only becomes exempt once it is smoothed while under the jurisdiction of the temple official. In that case, when you buy it back, you're not going to have to give Ma'aser anymore. So, Rabotai, in this Mishnah, we saw many halachot regarding how once you smoothen the pile, once the processing is completed, different halachot take effect. That is the end of Mishnah Vav and Perek Aleph. We begin Mishnah Bet. Very interesting halacha, Rabotai. The Torah says, Lo techle pe'at tzedcha liktzor. You're not allowed to reap your field. You're not allowed to harvest till the end of your field. You're supposed to leave a corner over. But we learn from here that Sadecha, the Torah says, Pe'at Sadecha, each and every field requires its own corner. So if you have two fields next to each other, if they're separated by a wall or by certain things we're going to see in the Mishnah, they have to have two separate corners. You cannot take from one field and say it's good for the other field also. Now the Mishnah is going to discuss different things that go between the fields if it constitutes a separation requiring two separate peot, two separate corners to be left. The following separate fields regarding the halacha Peah. Hanachal v'shilulit, a stream or irrigation canal that run through the field. If you have one field here and one field and a stream runs through, dividing them, you have to leave two separate corners. Derech hayachid v'derech harabim, u'shvi rabim, u'shvi yachid, akabu b'mot geshamim. A private road, a public road. Private refers to 4 amot wide, about 8 feet. A public road refers to 16 amot wide. Let's say I think it would be about 32 feet. I think it would be about 32 feet. I'm not sure. You have to check the math. A public or private path that is constantly used both in the summer season when the crops are harvested and in the rainy season when the crops are growing. These paths and roads have to be both used constantly. If it's not used constantly, it's not going to be a separation. It has to always be used in the summer season and the rainy season. That's going to separate the fields to make it have to give two separate corners. That bull, a strip of fallow land or land that is plowed but not planted. Fallow land is fertile land that's left uncultivated for a season or more to prevent its nutrients from becoming depleted by the constant growth of crops. You give it a break. By bull, the Mishnah means that land was not worked at all. It was not plowed, it was not planted in the current growing season. So you have a field and this bull, this unharvested, unplanted, uncultivated field next to it, V'anir, or land that is plowed but not planted, that's a separation. V'azera acher, or strip of land planted with a different species, that's also considered a separation. For example, you have a wheat field that has a strip of some other plant running through it. So you have wheat crops on one side, and then you have a strip of, let's say, cucumbers on the other side, right? That means now it's considered two separate fields. You must give two separate corners. The Rav says that the last three things, which is the fallow land, the uncultivated land, the plowed land, and different species, are separated only if they are at least the width of 3 furrows made by a plow. So you have to check the exact amount in order to make it a separation. The Mishnah now discusses the case of a different separator made after the field was planted, meaning, if someone cuts down a strip of unripe produce in his field to use as fodder, it separates the field into two. That's what Rabbi Meir holds, meaning the same crop covered the whole field, but before it ripened, the farmer cut down a strip of plants in the middle to use the stalks and unripe grain as animal feed. Therefore, when the crop later ripens and the harvest begins, this already cut strip is separating the two halves of the field. Rabbi Meir holds that divides the fields, and you have to leave peah now in each field. However, the sages say, it's not going to separate the field unless you also plow that strip after cutting down the unripe produce to give to animals. So we have a machloki between Rabbi Meir and Chachamim regarding this strip where you take out the unripe fruits. Rabbi Meir holds once you take out the fruits, it's already separated. You have to give two separate fields. Chachamim hold you have to actually plow that land. Now it's going to be separated. Otherwise, it's still considered one field. That is the end of today's Mishna Yomi. Yomi Rabotai, Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.